Blood on Christmas Holly Street, a Miss Marple Christmas mystery. Welcome, dear friends, to another peaceful evening together. I'm Jane, your host, and it brings me such joy to know you've chosen to spend your time with these gentle mysteries. Each story is crafted with care and affection, and watching our little community grow truly means so much. Thank you for being here and for sharing in these moments. If you haven't already, do subscribe so you never miss the next tale. Now settle in, find a cozy spot, and let's begin tonight's mystery. Blood on Christmas. Holly Street, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. Tea and Tension at the Vicarage. The morning began with a thin veil of frost over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, the kind that glittered prettily under the pale sun, but made one's fingers ache when lifting the milk bottle from the doorstep. Miss Marple, wrapped in her soft blue cardigan, sat by her sitting-room window, knitting needles gently clinking as she watched the sparrows hop about the garden. It was the sort of peaceful start she always found restorative after the flurry of Christmas preparations, quiet, orderly, reassuring. But, as often happened in her village, peace never stayed for long. The first warning came in the form of hurried footsteps along the garden path and a brisk rap upon her door. Without waiting for an answer, Mrs. Caroline Lane, the vicar's wife, swept in, a woman of warm heart, fluttering scarf, and an air perpetually halfway between excitement and alarm. She was breathless, cheeks flushed from the cold and perhaps from what she was about to say. "My dear Miss Marple," she exclaimed, unfastening her coat. "You won't believe the dreadful thing that's happened. Positively dreadful." Miss Marple set her knitting aside and smiled mildly, the sort of smile that could calm any storm. Now, Caroline, do sit down. There's fresh tea in the pot." Mrs. Lane perched on the edge of the chair, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. "It's Mrs. Bartlett, you see, the widow on Holly Street. Poor soul, found collapsed in her doorway this morning. Constable Wilkes says she might have slipped, but I dare say there's more to it." There was blood. The word hung in the air, unseemly and shocking against the room's gentle stillness. Miss Marple poured 2 cups of tea, steady hands betraying not the slightest tremor. "Blood, you say?" she murmured. "How very unfortunate." She was always so careful about her steps, especially in winter. Yes, but that's just it." Mrs. Lane leaned forward, eyes bright with the thrill of tragedy. The poor dear was still in her slippers. What was she doing outside in slippers at that hour? And the postboy found her door wide open. "It's simply not right." Miss Marple passed her a sugar lump. "How curious. And the cause of death?" "They don't know yet. The doctor was called, but you know what Dr. Haydock's like. Says very little until he's sure. They say she might have been struck, or perhaps she fell on something sharp." "Oh, and there was a parcel, half-wrapped, lying beside her?" Miss Marple's eyes lifted, a faint gleam of thought flickering there. "A parcel?" "Yes, tied with red ribbon." "Isn't it awful?" "Just before Christmas, too. They say she'd been preparing gifts for her nieces. Clara and Edith, I think their names are. Both visiting for the holiday." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. She reached for her cup, gazing into the swirl of tea leaves. Families do come together at such times. Not always peacefully. Mrs. Lane gave a scandalized little gasp. "Oh, Miss Marple, surely you don't mean—" "My dear, I mean nothing at all," she replied, smiling kindly. "But human nature is a most fascinating puzzle. One sees so many pieces in a village like ours: envy, pride, affection, resentment. They all live next door to one another, rather like us." Mrs. Lane gave a nervous laugh, uncertain whether this was philosophy or subtle warning. "Well, I do hope it's nothing sinister. I told the vicar I shan't rest until we know what truly happened." "Then I expect you'll be quite wakeful for some time," said Miss Marple, eyes twinkling. Truth seldom comes quickly, though it often leaves footprints behind. Outside, the church bells began their slow toll for the 11 o'clock service. Mrs. Lane stood, flustered but gratified to have been the bearer of such vital news. "You'll come by later, won't you?" "Everyone will be talking of it." "I imagine they will," Miss Marple replied, walking her guest to the door. The cold air met them with a bite, the kind that carried both clarity and unease. When the door closed and silence returned, Miss Marple remained a moment by the window. The frost had begun to melt along the hedges, tiny rivulets tracing their way down toward the lane. Somewhere in the distance, she could just make out the red-tiled roofs of Holly Street. Peaceful, ordinary, unchanged, and yet, she thought, something beneath that calm surface had cracked. She sat again, hands folded neatly in her lap, and let her thoughts drift through memory. Mrs. Bartlett, yes, a gentle sort of woman, though there had been sadness about her since her husband's death last winter. Kind to children, generous with puddings, fond of gossip, but never malicious. And yet there had been something faintly restless in her eyes, as though she carried a secret she could neither speak nor set down. Miss Marple reached for her teacup once more, now cooled. "Blood on Holly Street," she said softly to herself. What a curious phrase. Her expression didn't change, but in her mind's eye she saw again that flicker of red ribbon and the open door, imagined from Caroline's telling. She had seen such things before, doors left ajar when hearts were shut tight, and stains that told stories better than tongues could. Outside, the sparrows scattered suddenly, as if startled by some distant noise. Miss Marple watched them go, her gaze thoughtful and keen. She had seen that look before, the kind that meant someone's peace was built upon a lie. A soft knock at the door roused Miss Marple from her afternoon knitting. She glanced up, setting her needles aside, and called, "Do come in." Constable Wilkes stepped through, boots tapping lightly on the wooden floor. His breath still carried the coldness of the street outside, and a hint of urgency shadowed his features. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he began, doffing his cap. "I hope I'm not interrupting your quiet." "Not at all," she said calmly, gesturing to a chair beside the fire. "Please sit." "You look brisk, Wilkes. What brings you here today?" He eased into the chair, his eyes scanning the room with that careful, alert focus of a man who notices everything, yet reveals little. "I thought it best to keep you informed," he said quietly. "Given your reputation for noticing things others miss." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene yet unreadable. "I appreciate that, Constable." "Do tell me what has prompted this visit." Wilkes leaned forward, lowering his voice further, as though the walls themselves might listen. "It concerns Mrs. Bartlett. The scene suggested a fall, accidental perhaps, but there's something more. When I examined her wrist, I noticed a thin reddish mark, almost like a ribbon had been pressed there. Delicate, not deep, but distinct. It doesn't fit with an ordinary tumble." Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly to the steaming teacup in her hand, then back to the constable. Her face remained calm, but her mind was already cataloguing possibilities, testing each quietly against her knowledge of the village and its inhabitants. "Interesting," she murmured, her tone gentle, yet charged with quiet scrutiny. "A ribbon, you say? And there were no signs of a struggle elsewhere?" "None that we could find," Wilkes replied. "Everything else was in its place, as if she had simply been moving through her home. But that wrist, there's a story there. I'm certain of it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, the calm exterior belying the sudden spark of curiosity within. She set the cup down deliberately, then asked a single, precise question. "Was the present still there?" Wilkes blinked. "The music box?" "Yes." Her voice was soft, almost casual, but it carried a weight that made him lean closer. "The gift." The one that caused her to pause, to hesitate. "Was it still where she would have left it?" "Yes," he said after a moment, studying her carefully. It was untouched, still in its wrapping, golden ribbon tied neatly. Whoever, or whatever caused her harm, did not remove it. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though that small piece of information illuminated 1,000 quiet paths. She allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "Then we may assume the story is more delicate than it appears. One simple question can open more doors than any key, Wilkes." The constable nodded slowly, realizing that while he had thought he was visiting to inform her, it was she who now quietly guided the direction of the investigation. And as Miss Marple returned her gaze to the window, watching the late afternoon light settle over the village, It was clear she had already begun tracing invisible threads through the peaceful streets of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Hummed Carols. By the following morning the village had returned, at least on the surface, to its cheerful bustle. Snow still lined the hedgerows, glinting beneath a pale sun, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and distant baking. Children dragged evergreen branches toward the church hall, their laughter ringing bright against the cold, while the vicar's wife supervised from the steps, declaring every ribbon just a touch crooked before fixing it herself. Life in St. Mary Mead had a remarkable way of carrying on, as though death were an unfortunate but passing inconvenience, soon folded away beneath layers of good manners and holiday spirit. Miss Marple sat by her front window, a familiar post, with her knitting resting untouched on her lap. From there she could see nearly the whole of the green, the post office, the baker's, and the little square where a pine tree had been raised 2 days before. The villagers were decorating it now, singing snatches of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen as they worked. Every so often someone would glance toward Holly Street, lowering their voice to a whisper. Then, just as quickly, the chatter would return to normal. There was comfort in routine, Miss Marple reflected, but also danger in it. People busied themselves with ribbons and puddings not only out of joy, but to quiet the thoughts they'd rather not entertain. The rhythm of daily life, especially at Christmas, offered both protection and concealment. She smiled faintly, remembering another Christmas not so many years ago, when Mrs. Bartlett had organized the village wreath-making competition. How proud she'd been, humming, "Hark!" the herald angels sing while trimming holly and ivy. Her laughter had filled the hall that evening, though even then Miss Marple had noticed the faintest tremor beneath it, a sadness stitched between the notes. After her husband's death the following spring, Mrs. Bartlett had kept that habit of humming. She hummed as she queued at the butcher's, as she watered her garden, as she walked home along Holly Street with her basket full of tinned peaches and biscuits. It had seemed brave at first, a widow's small defiance against loneliness. But as months passed, there was something else in it, something brittle, as though the sound were there to keep silence from swallowing her whole. Now, as Miss Marple watched the carolers gathering outside the church, she could almost hear that same melody drifting through memory. "Silent night," he sung, "a song of peace, yes, but peace was rarely what it seemed." A knock at the window startled her from thought. It was young Tommy Wren, clutching a sprig of mistletoe. "For you, Miss Marple," he called through the glass, cheeks red from the cold. She opened the door with a smile. "Why, how kind, Tommy. You'll make some young lady very happy one day if you keep such manners." He grinned, proud and shy all at once. "Mum says we're all to make the place cheerful again. Mr. Carter says sadness isn't good for Christmas." "No," Miss Marple said gently, taking the mistletoe, "but neither is forgetting too quickly." Tommy frowned a little, unsure of her meaning, then waved and ran back toward the square where other children were laughing. She watched them go, the green and gold ribbons streaming from their hand. For a moment, the whole scene looked like something out of a storybook. So bright, so full of comfort, that one might almost believe the world had never known sorrow. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know better. She had seen too many quiet faces that smiled for the village and wept for themselves once the curtains were drawn. Mrs. Bartlett had been one of them, always kind, always polite, always humming. And yet behind that gentle habit there had been a question lingering unspoken. What had she been trying so hard not to hear? Miss Marple returned to her chair, placing the mistletoe in a small glass by the window. The tea beside her had gone cold again. She smiled at the sight. It was a small domestic annoyance grounding her thoughts. She took up her knitting and began once more, though the rhythm of her needles seemed slower, thoughtful. Outside, the church bells began their rehearsal for the midnight service. Voices floated through the air, familiar, harmonious, almost comforting. But beneath those warm tones Miss Marple heard something else, the uneven cadence of human life, the pauses between words, the hesitation in certain verses. A village could sing together beautifully, but even in song some voices strained to keep in tune. She let the curtain fall slightly, the edge of it casting a soft shadow across the room. The sunlight glimmered on the mistletoe berries, pale and fragile. "Poor Mrs. Bartlett," she murmured. "So much cheer, so little comfort." Then almost absently, she began to hum herself, not a carol, but a simple, wordless tune that belonged to no particular season. Her voice, though soft, carried a tone of reflection more than sadness. She thought of the widow's neat handwriting, the parcels tied with care, and that red ribbon now gone missing. It all formed a picture she could not yet see clearly, but the edges were beginning to take shape. She had learned long ago that truth rarely shouted. It hummed quietly in the background, like a familiar carol no one quite remembered learning. Some smiles, she thought, were painted for the village. Others were worn for survival. Miss Marple pushed open the door to Hobbs's grocer, the bell tinkling softly above her. The shop smelled of freshly baked bread, dried herbs, and a hint of winter apples. Behind the counter, Mr. Hobbs arranged tins with meticulous care, humming a tune that barely reached the far corner where two villagers huddled in conversation. She moved slowly along the shelves, pretending to examine the apples while listening. The men's voices were hushed, but curiosity always travels faster than discretion. "Scar on his chin," one whispered. "I saw him leave Holly Street just after 10. Didn't look like anyone around should know him." "Shh," said the other, glancing toward the counter nervously. "If Hobbs overhears—" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. She turned to Mr. Hobbs, smiling sweetly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hobbs. You're busy as ever, I see. Tell me, do you often have deliveries this late in the evening?" The grocer blinked, a faint pink rising to his cheeks. "Oh, not usually, Miss Marple. Only occasionally. For urgent orders, you understand. Special customers." Miss Marple's fingers brushed over a row of preserves, her gaze calm and deliberate. "Special customers," she repeated softly. "I see. And would these customers perhaps come and go quietly, wishing not to be noticed?" Hobbs cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. "Well, sometimes yes. There are always those who prefer discretion. Nothing unusual about that in a village like ours." The two men in the corner stiffened, and Miss Marple allowed her glance to wander casually in their direction. "I couldn't help overhearing a snippet," she said lightly. "A man with a scar, leaving Holly Street late at night. Surely that must have been someone passing through?" The grocer's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a stack of tin cans. I don't rightly know, Miss Marple. Perhaps a traveller, a stranger. Only, well, you know how it is." "Everyone has a story, and not all stories are told." Miss Marple nodded gently, as if absorbing this confession for no reason other than its quiet importance. Her eyes lingered on the men in the corner. "Every village has its ghosts," she murmured, "and not all of them are dead." The two villagers glanced at each other nervously, then at their feet, while Mr. Hobbs straightened and coughed. "I dare say you'll forgive my blush, Miss Marple. Sometimes even a harmless question can stir memories one would rather leave untouched." Miss Marple's smile remained serene. "Of course, Mr. Hobbs. Discretion is the village's most valuable commodity, after kindness, of course." As she left the shop, the bell chimed softly behind her. The frost outside had thickened, and the footprints leading from Holly Street seemed suddenly more mysterious, more telling. Some secrets, she thought, are carried quietly on the wind, heard only by those who listen carefully, and perhaps remembered forever. Up to 3. A present without a name. Inspector Wilkes arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just after dusk, his boots leaving damp marks on the mat. The air outside had turned brittle with frost, and his breath rose in clouds as he greeted her. "Evening, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not in the least, Inspector," she replied, ushering him inside with a gentle smile. "I was just about to put the kettle on. You'll have tea, of course." He nodded, his usual briskness subdued by something weightier than the winter chill. "That'd be much appreciated, ma'am." As Miss Marple poured 2 cups, she noticed he'd placed a small brown paper parcel on the edge of her table, wrapped in evidence paper and tied with neat twine. There was a carefulness in the way he set it down, as though it were both fragile and dangerous. She glanced at it over the steam of her teacup. "That's not one of your Christmas deliveries, I presume?" Wilkes gave a weary half-smile. "If only." It was found in Mrs. Bartlett's hallway, just beside her hand. No sender's name, no markings at all. We thought perhaps it was an innocent gift, but... He hesitated, as if reluctant to continue. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the parcel. But it wasn't? He untied the twine and peeled back the evidence paper, revealing a box wrapped in fine cream paper and a golden ribbon now dulled where fingers had handled it. The ribbon's end bore a faint smudge, brownish red against the pale sheen. "It's exquisite wrapping," Miss Marple murmured, touching the edge of the paper delicately. "Not the sort one buys in St. Mary Mead. Imported, I should think." Wilkes nodded. "That was my thought too. We found the same style sold in Bath. Expensive stuff, mind you. Hardly the sort of thing you'd pick up at the post office." He lifted the lid with care. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a small music box shaped like a star. Its metal surface gleamed faintly, and when Wilkes turned the tiny key, it began to play Silent Night. The notes were soft, lilting, and terribly gentle, so gentle that for a moment both of them simply listened. Miss Marple's expression softened. "A beautiful piece," she said quietly, "almost too beautiful to belong in tragedy." Then she saw it, the faint smear of red across the velvet lining, half hidden by the hinge. It was small but unmistakable. "The coroner confirmed it," said Wilkes grimly. "Blood. We're running prints, though I don't expect much." "Whoever sent it knew what they were doing." Miss Marple set her cup down slowly. "A music box that plays a hymn of peace," she mused. "And yet it has witnessed murder." Wilkes folded his arms. "We thought perhaps it was a gift, maybe from a friend or relative." "No one's admitted to sending it," and the postmark. "There wasn't one. Delivered by hand, we think." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the golden ribbon. "People often say Christmas brings out the best in us. I've always thought it also brings out what we most wish to hide. Old griefs, old envies, old wrongs, all dressed in tinsel and light." Wilkes gave a dry laugh. "You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. I suppose that's why I'm here. I hoped you might see something we've missed." She rose and walked to the window. The village green lay silent beneath a thin layer of frost, the street lamps haloed in mist. "Tell me," she said softly, "was Mrs. Bartlett expecting company that evening?" "Not that we know of," he said. "But she had sent for some cherries from the grocer. They were found on her counter, unopened." Miss Marple nodded absently. "Cherries for a Christmas pudding, perhaps. And a parcel without a name. A woman alone, and a gift delivered by hand." She turned back to the inspector. "You see, Wilkes, sometimes the danger isn't in what is sent, but in what it reminds someone of. A tune, a scent, a face. Murder often begins in memory." Wilkes frowned. "So you think the sender was someone she knew?" Miss Marple gave him that small, inscrutable smile of hers. "Oh, I imagine so. People rarely die from the hands of strangers in villages like ours." "Strangers may bring mystery, Inspector, but seldom motive." The music box wound down, the final note trembling into silence. The cottage seemed colder for its absence. Wilkes rewrapped the parcel carefully, his movements respectful now. "You'll tell me if you think of anything?" "Of course," she said. "Though I dare say I already am." He paused at the door, cap in hand. "You've seen things like this before, haven't you?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window again, where snow began to fall in lazy spirals. "More often than I'd wish. Human nature, you see, it never quite changes. It only wraps itself in different paper." The door closed behind him and she was alone again, the faint scent of tea and evidence paper lingering in the air. She sat for a long while, listening to the ticking clock and the wind beyond the glass. On the table lay a single golden thread from the ribbon, left behind like a whisper. She touched it lightly, then folded it into her handkerchief. Outside, the first church bell of evening began to toll, solemn and slow, marking another day closer to Christmas, and perhaps another step nearer to the truth. The carriage rolled slowly up the snowy lane, wheels crunching against the frost, as Clara and Edith Bartlett alighted at the vicarage door. Their coats were neat, gloves pristine, and hats perfectly perched. Yet there was a subtle difference in how each moved. Clara's steps hurried and uncertain, Edith's measured and composed. Miss Marple rose to greet them, her eyes warm but observant. "Welcome, my dears." "I'm so sorry for your loss." Clara forced a trembling smile, hands clasped tightly around her muff. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It is a terrible shock." Edith inclined her head slightly, her calm demeanour almost serene. "Indeed." "Aunt Millicent was a remarkable woman," she said quietly, voice smooth, betraying little emotion. The vicar's wife bustled forward with tea, offering comforting words and a sympathetic glance. Miss Marple observed silently, noting the rehearsed cadence of their conversation, a slight avoidance in Clara's eyes whenever mention of the music box or the parcel came up as they settled near the fire. Clara fidgeted with her gloves, breaking her gaze on the mantel repeatedly. Edith, in contrast, sat erect, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes scanning the room with a composed attentiveness. "You'll want to hear about your aunt's final days," Miss Marple said softly. She remained spirited despite her age, keeping her garden in order and her ledger tidy. Clara nodded quickly, glancing away whenever the parcel was mentioned. "Yes, the garden. She always loved her flowers," she murmured, her voice slightly strained. Edith added smoothly, "And the charity work." She was most conscientious. Her calm delivery contrasted with Clara's nervous energy, creating a subtle tension in the room, one that Miss Marple noted carefully. The tea was poured, the china clinking softly. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, observing how each niece sipped their tea. Clara's hand shook just enough to betray her unease, while Edith maintained her deliberate composure. "Did your aunt speak of anyone in particular recently?" Miss Marple asked casually, her tone gentle. "Friends, or perhaps visitors?" Clara hesitated, eyes flicking to her sister before answering. "No, not that I can recall." She avoided further probing, keeping her focus on the teacup. Edith, however, smiled faintly and replied with care. She mentioned Mr. Hargreaves once, but only in passing. "Nothing of concern." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though it remained discerning. She made a quiet mental note. Clara's avoidance of the parcel, the nervous energy that contradicted her rehearsed expressions, and Edith's calm, controlled exterior. There was a subtle imbalance here. Grief, yes, but also secrecy. In grief, she thought to herself, watching the two, truth hides behind tears and trembling smiles. As the nieces continued their polite exchanges, Miss Marple's mind traced invisible threads of hesitation, concealment, and carefully maintained appearances. The parcel, she knew, was the key, though neither niece yet realized how closely it tied to the unfolding story of Holly Street. Chapter 4. The Garden Gate. Clue. The snow had fallen again during the night, soft, unhurried flakes that cloaked the village in silence. By morning, Holly Street looked almost innocent, as though tragedy had never brushed its doorstep. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warm grey coat, walked slowly toward Mrs. Bartlett's house, her boots pressing neat impressions into the fresh white carpet. The cold air sharpened her thoughts. Mysteries always seemed clearer when the world was still. The constable's cordon had been lifted, leaving only a faint memory of where the rope had hung. The front step, swept clean by the vicar's wife earlier that day, looked deceptively peaceful. Yet Miss Marple knew peace could be a disguise. She studied the threshold, then turned her gaze toward the narrow path that ran along the side of the house, disappearing into the back garden. Few would have noticed it. Most eyes were drawn to the doorway where poor Mrs. Bartlett had fallen. But Miss Marple's eyes were trained by years of quiet observation, and she saw what others did not. A second trail of footprints pressed faintly into the snow, half melted, leading away from the main path. The stride was longer, heavier, not the shuffle of an old woman carrying her shopping, but the purposeful tread of someone leaving quickly. She followed them carefully. each step measured so as not to disturb the evidence nature had left behind. The prints curved slightly toward the garden gate, then stopped just before it, as if the person had paused or been interrupted. Beyond the gate, the lane sloped downward toward the churchyard, the snow there untouched. No return prints. Whoever it was had not come back this way. Miss Marple crouched slightly, her gloved hand brushing the frozen edge of the gatepost. Something caught her eye, a small, crushed holly leaf caught between the wooden slats. It was streaked faintly with red. Not the deep brown of paint or rust, but something fresher, darker. She lifted it delicately, turning it toward the light. Blood, she murmured, or something very like it. The holly's sharp edge had pierced her glove, and she felt a tiny prick against her skin, a reminder that even beauty carried thorns. She tucked the leaf into a small paper envelope from her pocket, an old habit from years of helping Inspector Wilkes. Standing, she let her gaze sweep across the garden. The snow was otherwise untouched, save for the single line of footprints and the faint imprint of a box-shaped object near the path. Perhaps a parcel dropped or delivered. Miss Marple's breath formed soft clouds in the air. The entire scene felt like a frozen memory caught between movement and silence. The snow, she thought, remembers what the villagers wish to forget. She closed the gate gently, leaving it exactly as she found it, and turned back toward the lane. Somewhere behind those drawn curtains, someone knew why a golden ribbon had been tied with care, and whose hand had bled upon a holly leaf in the falling snow. Evening settled softly over St. Mary Mead, the kind of quiet that made lamplight seem warmer and secrets easier to whisper. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting laid aside when the doorbell chimed. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Goodwin, wrapped in a fur-lined shawl and flushed with urgency. "My dear Miss Marple," she began as she stepped inside, "I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I simply couldn't rest without telling someone what came to me." "Do sit down," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with her usual calm. Memories have a way of surfacing when the house grows quiet. "Tell me everything." Mrs. Goodwin perched on the edge of her chair, the firelight flickering across her face. It was the evening before poor Mrs. Bartlett was found. I had been to the post-box, you see, with some church envelopes, and on my way back I noticed a man standing quite still by the hedge near Holly Street. At first I thought it was Mr. Groves, he's forever losing his spectacles, but when I called out, he didn't answer. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Her eyes half-lidded in thought, Mrs. Goodwin continued, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He was tall, quite tall and well-dressed. His coat was dark, but his gloves were remarkable. Fine leather, soft-looking, like something from London. Not the sort our local men would wear, you understand? And he was waiting, Miss Marple, I'm sure of it. Waiting for someone. Did you see his face? No, he turned away as soon as I passed. But there was something deliberate in his stillness. Not a man out for a stroll. More like one who wished not to be seen. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Interesting," she murmured. "Very interesting indeed. A man who cares for fine gloves rarely dirties his own hands. Unless, of course, he must." Mrs. Goodwin blinked, uncertain whether that was meant literally. "You don't suppose—" "I suppose nothing yet," Miss Marple said gently. "But I have long believed that vanity leaves fingerprints even snow cannot hide. Tell me, Mrs. Goodwin, was he near the post-box when you first noticed him?" "Yes, just beside it. And when I turned back at the corner, he was gone." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already spinning its quiet web. "Then we may safely assume he was waiting to deliver something. Or someone." Mrs. Goodwin shivered. "You make it sound so sinister." "Oh, I do hope not," Miss Marple said kindly. "But in my experience, wickedness dresses itself well when it wishes to pass for ordinary." When her visitor departed, Miss Marple sat for a long time in the gentle hush that followed. She reached for her notebook, the one kept tucked beside her hymn book, and wrote a single line across the page, "Men who love fine gloves." Beneath it, she began a quiet list of names, shopkeepers, visitors, tradesmen, any man in the village whose vanity might reach his fingertips. The list was short, but in Miss Marple's mind It glowed like the first light through stained glass. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Choir Loft. The next evening, the church glowed like a lantern in the frost, its stained glass dimmed but alive with flickering candlelight. Inside, the choir was gathered for rehearsal, scarves loosened, music sheets rustling, breath rising like mist in the chill. The sound of voices filled the air, soft and uncertain at first, then settling into the familiar rhythm of silent night. Miss Marple sat quietly in the back pew, her knitting in her lap, pretending to focus on a dropped stitch while her ears did the real work. She came often to rehearsals, claiming a fondness for music, though the vicar suspected she came for the gossip that arrived with it. Both were true. As the sopranos faltered through the second verse, Miss Marple's attention drifted toward the young tenor near the aisle, a fair-haired man of perhaps 30, new to the village. His voice was clear and practiced, though he hummed more than he sang as if distracted. When the organist called for a pause, Miss Marple caught it, those few notes he hummed to himself without thinking. It was Silent Night, but not the ordinary carol. He hummed it with a strange variation, a lilting half-step that matched precisely the version from the little music box found beside Mrs. Bartlett's body. A small alteration too subtle for most ears. But Miss Marple had always noticed small things. When the rehearsal ended, she approached him as the others packed away hymnals. "Such a lovely voice," she said warmly. "It's been ages since I heard anyone carry that melody so naturally." He flushed with modesty. "Oh, thank you, ma'am. I don't really know the proper note. I just picked up the tune somewhere." "Somewhere?" she repeated gently. "That particular arrangement isn't common. It sounds almost personal." He hesitated, shifting his music sheet. "Well, there's a gentleman staying at the King's Arms, Mr. Drake, I think." "He's the one who taught me the variation," said it was an old family version from Austria. "Thought it sounded finer than the usual church version." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her hands. "Mr. Drake, you say? I don't believe I've heard of him before." "He's new," the tenor replied. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he plays the piano beautifully. Comes to listen sometimes when we rehearse." "I see," said Miss Marple, her voice as mild as ever. "And this tune, how long ago did he teach it to you?" "Oh, just a few days before." "Before it all happened." "I didn't think anything of it." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind. "Of course not. Music often carries stories we never mean to tell." The young man looked puzzled, but nodded, gathering his coat and slipping out into the snowy night. Miss Marple remained a moment longer, the church empty around her, the air still humming faintly with the carol's echo. One tune, two players, yet only one could know its secret. She rose slowly, fastening her coat, and stepped out into the darkness, where the same haunting melody seemed to linger in the cold wind like a whisper that refused to fade. Snow still clung to the thatched eaves of the King's Arms, though the hearth within burned with a steady orange glow. Miss Marple stepped inside, brushing off her gloves and pausing to let her eyes adjust to the firelit dim. The scent of mulled wine, roasting chestnuts, and pine resin hung thick in the air, comforting to most. But tonight it carried a faint undertone of unease. Behind the counter stood Mr. Hargreaves, the innkeeper, a stout man with red cheeks and the expression of one who had seen more than he cared to tell. He greeted her with a nervous smile. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Cold one today. Care for a drop of tea to warm you?" "Tea would be lovely," she said, seating herself by the window where frost traced ghostly patterns across the glass. "I understand you've had some interesting visitors lately." The man's hand twitched slightly as he poured. "Oh, you mean the gentleman in room 3? Polite sort. Paid on time. Nothing unusual about him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You do surprise me, Mr. Hargreaves. They say he had a rather striking scar along his chin." "Not the kind of feature one forgets easily." The innkeeper hesitated, his cup rattling faintly on its saucer. "Well, now you mention it. Yes, small thing. White as chalk, looked old. Spoke fine, though. Educated, maybe London. Said he was visiting friends for Christmas." "Friends on Holly Street, perhaps?" she asked lightly. He looked at her sharply, then sighed. You've heard, I suppose?
Everyone had.
He did have a parcel brought to him 2 days before that poor woman passed. Nice wrapping, golden ribbon.
I thought it was one of those expensive gifts they send from the city. And who delivered it?
That's the odd bit.
No one saw.
It was just there one morning on the hall table. No note, no messenger. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully.
And when did he leave the inn?
Early Christmas morning. Before light. Said he had business to attend to, thanked me kindly and vanished down the road.
Didn't even wait for breakfast. I found his room neat as a pin, except what?
Mr. Hargreaves lowered his voice. A holly leaf on the window-sill, crushed like it'd been caught in his sleeve.
I thought nothing of it till I heard what happened on Holly Street. For a long moment, only the fire crackled.
Miss Marple gazed into the flames, her expression unreadable. You've a good memory, Mr. Hargreaves. Most would have missed such a thing. He gave a sheepish shrug. I try to keep my eyes open, though sometimes I wish I didn't. The village changes at Christmas, Miss Marple. So many strangers passing through. You never know which ones mean well and which ones don't. She rose, smoothing her coat.
That's very true, she said softly.
The village welcomes everyone at Christmas, even those who shouldn't be welcomed at all. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft, relentless, covering every trace of footprints leading away from the King's Arms. Chapter 6. The Widow's Ledger. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room crackled softly as she unfolded the ledger, its worn leather cover creaking like an old confession. It had been brought to her by the vicar's wife, who claimed it was simply part of the estate sorting. But the moment Miss Marple laid eyes on the first page, she knew it was something else entirely. The writing was neat and deliberate, each entry dated, every donation carefully noted. Mrs. Bartlett had always been meticulous. Each pound and shilling was accounted for, gifts to the church, funds for the orphanage, even a few discreet contributions to families who would never admit they needed help. To the untrained eye, it was a testament to kindness. But Miss Marple, with her quiet suspicion of appearances, read between the lines. Some entries were perfectly regular, almost rhythmic in their pattern. Then, midway through December, something broke that rhythm. A donation for £50, marked only with the initials R.H., no description, no note of purpose. The name was written in a slightly different hand, the ink a shade darker, as though added later. Miss Marple traced the letters with a gloved fingertip. R.H., she murmured. Now who might you be? The amount was generous, too generous for ordinary charity. Mrs. Bartlett had never been wealthy, though she managed her affairs with care. £50 was not a gift, it was a statement. Either something had been repaid, or something had been purchased. She turned a few pages back, seeking pattern or precedent. The ledger revealed a woman whose kindness was genuine yet cautious, one who liked her world balanced, each act of generosity matched by discretion. And so this entry, abrupt and unexplained, stood out like a smudge on clean linen. Outside, the church bells tolled 4 times, and the sound carried through the window. Miss Marple leaned back, eyes narrowing. £50. R.H., the music. Box, the ribbon, the crushed holly leaf. Each fragment of the mystery shifted slightly, forming a new constellation in her mind. The initials stirred something faintly familiar. She rose, walked to the small oak writing desk by her window, and opened the parish newsletter folded beside her blotter. The list of benefactors was long, but one name caught her attention. Richard Hargreaves, proprietor of the King's Arms. The same man who had spoken of the stranger and his parcel with such nervous care. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Kindness and guilt, she said aloud, can share the same handwriting. Could the innkeeper have been paying Mrs. Bartlett for
silence? Or was it the other way around? Had she been helping him with some private burden, some debt best kept unspoken? The possibilities branched quietly in her mind, like frost on a window pane.
As the kettle whistled, she closed the ledger and set it neatly on the table. The truth was not yet clear, but she could sense it pressing close, like a letter tucked beneath a doormat, waiting for the right pair of eyes to find it. Miss Marple poured her tea, steady and unhurried, the faintest smile playing on her lips. There was no need to rush. Secrets like tea leaves revealed themselves only when steeped in time. The drawing-room at the Bartlett house was dimly lit, the fire reduced to a quiet glow. Shadows from the flickering flame trembled along the wallpaper, giving the illusion of movement in a room that had gone still with mourning. Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair nearest the hearth, hands folded neatly in her lap. Across from her, Clara clutched a handkerchief, its lace edges crumpled beyond recognition. "I can't bear it any more," Clara whispered, voice breaking on the word. "They all think it was an accident, that she slipped, that the cold or her heart gave way, but it wasn't. It couldn't have been." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She had learned long ago that silence could coax the truth more gently than questions. Clara stared into the fire, as if it might swallow her thoughts. "Aunt Millicent knew something. She said as much the week before she died. She told me, if anything happens to me, remember, proof lies where the tune begins and ends. I thought it was just another of her peculiar phrases. But now—" "The music box," Miss Marple said softly. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, that awful thing. It used to play while she wrote her letters. She said it helped her think, but she'd changed lately. She wouldn't let anyone touch it. When Edith tried to wind it, she snapped at her. That wasn't like Aunt Millicent at all." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, though her mind had already drawn several quiet lines between this confession and the ledger entry she'd read earlier. "You said she planned to expose someone," she prompted gently. "Do you know who?" Clara hesitated. "Only that it was a man. She never said his name, but she mentioned a scar, on his chin, I think. She said evil often wore a gentleman's coat." The fire cracked, sending a spark across the hearthstone. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her face bathed in amber light. "A scar on the chin," she murmured. "How very particular." Clara nodded miserably. She was frightened. "I didn't see it at first because she was so good at pretending. She kept busy with her garden, the parish work. All of it a disguise, I think. But that last week she seemed resolved, as though she'd already made her decision." "What
sort of decision, my dear?" "She said she'd had enough of keeping quiet."
That truth was a duty, her exact words. I asked what she meant, but she only smiled and told me not to worry. She said Christmas was a time for revelations. The clock on the mantel chimed 6 times, soft and deliberate. Clara dabbed her eyes, voice trembling. If only I'd pressed her to explain. I think she had proof. Something written, something locked away. Miss Marple rose gently, smoothing the folds of her skirt. "You've done very well, Clara. Your aunt would be grateful you remembered her words." She glanced toward the dying fire. The melody of Silent Night seemed to echo faintly in her mind, the same tune that had played from the blood-stained music box. "When truth hides in music," she said quietly, "one must listen between the notes." Chapter 7. The Man with the Scarlet Scar. Snow still clung to the cobbles outside the King's Arms, the kind that refused to melt even under the weak morning sun. Miss Marple stepped carefully through the doorway, her boots leaving crisp impressions that the innkeeper, Mr. Hargreaves, seemed reluctant to notice. Behind her, Inspector Wilkes removed his hat, shaking off the snow before following her inside. The familiar smell of wood polish and ale hung in the air, mingled with a trace of cigar smoke that hadn't yet faded. "Morning, Mr. Hargreaves," Wilkes began, his tone polite but firm.
"I hope we're not disturbing you." The innkeeper's hands fidgeted with the bar towel.
"Not at all, Inspector. Though I dare say you've been doing a lot of disturbing this week." His laugh was hollow, an attempt at normality that didn't quite succeed. Miss Marple gave him one of her gentle, grandmotherly smiles. "We thought we might ask a few more questions about your guest," she said. "The gentleman with the scar." Hargreaves hesitated, eyes flickering toward the empty counter. "I told you he left early Christmas morning."
"Paid his bill, said he was heading north." Wilkes walked slowly toward the bar, his eyes sweeping the shelves and floor with the measured gaze of a man who knew how to read disorder.
Miss Marple, meanwhile, reached out to straighten a small glass jar that sat crookedly beside the register. Something caught her eye just below it, a corner of fabric wedged behind the counter's moulding. "Oh dear," she murmured, kneeling slightly. "What's this?" Wilkes stepped closer as she drew it free. A torn glove, black leather, lined with a flash of red silk. The rip was fresh, the edges uneven. "Belong to your lodgers, Mr. Hargreaves?" the inspector asked mildly. The innkeeper's face drained of colour.
I've never seen it before.
"Truly I haven't. I keep the place tidy. There's no reason anything like that should be lying about." Miss Marple turned the glove over in her hands, studying the interior. The red silk gleamed faintly in the lamplight, elegant and expensive. "Strange, isn't it?" she said softly. "Such fine lining for something meant to be worn in a place like this."
"A craftsman's glove, not a labourer's," Wilkes nodded. "And torn, which means someone left in a hurry, Mr. Hargreaves."
"Perhaps one of the travellers dropped it. Someone passing through." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, though her tone made the word sound delicate, almost weightless. She could see the faintest smudge of dust across the glove's back, the same greyish hue she'd noticed on the parcel paper days earlier. The connection stirred quietly in her mind. The inspector pocketed the glove carefully. "We'll have it examined," he said. "You're sure you've nothing more to tell us?" The innkeeper shook his head too quickly.
"I've told you everything, Inspector."
"Everything I know." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him a moment longer. "It's quite all right, Mr. Hargreaves. People often remember more after they've had a little time to think." As they stepped back into the cold, Wilkes glanced sideways at her. "You think he's hiding something?" "Oh, I'm sure of it," she replied, her breath misting in the air. "But not what he thinks he's hiding. Some men leave calling cards without meaning to." The stable boy was a quiet lad, no more than 16, with straw still clinging to his sleeves and a habit of speaking as if afraid his words might spook the horses. He stood before Miss Marple and Inspector Wilkes in the chilly yard behind the King's Arms, the morning light pale and cold over the frost. His breath came in small white clouds as he twisted his cap between his hands. "I didn't mean to listen, ma'am," he began, glancing nervously between them. "Only I was fetching water from the trough that night, Christmas Eve it was, and I heard voices near the holly hedge by the lane." Miss Marple's expression was kind but intent. "Go on, my dear."
"Whose voices were they?"
"One was a lady's, soft but cross. The other, him. The man with the scar." Wilkes took a step closer. "You're certain of that?" The boy nodded firmly. "Yes, sir."
"I saw his face when the lantern light caught it."
He was standing close to her, angry, though not shouting. More like her, if you take my meaning. He kept saying something about promises broken. Said she'd ruined him once already, and that this time he wouldn't let her walk away. Miss Marple's eyes lowered slightly as though considering an invisible pattern.
"And what did Mrs. Bartlett say?"
She told him it was over, that she'd already made things right. Then she said something I didn't understand, something about the box, keeping it safe. The man grabbed her arm just for a moment. Then she pulled away and told him to leave her alone. I heard him say, "You'll regret this, Millie." And then he walked off toward the main road. The boy's voice faltered. She just stood there after that, staring at the hedge.
"I thought about calling out, but she looked
so tired, like she'd already said goodbye to something." Inspector Wilkes made a note, his pencil scratching quietly. "You've done well to tell us this," he said. "You sure of the time?" "Near 10 o'clock, sir." The church bell had just rung. Miss Marple gave the boy a reassuring nod. "You've been very brave. Sometimes the smallest observations hold the greatest truth." As the lad returned to the stables, Wilkes turned to her. "So it was no burglary?"
"No theft, just—"
Whatever was between them. Miss Marple looked toward the distant holly hedge, its berries bright against the snow.
"Not whatever, Inspector."
It was remorse, Wilkes frowned.
"You think he loved her?"
In his own way, perhaps. Or rather, he hated himself for what he'd done, and her for reminding him of it. Broken promises can be cruel things. They begin as weakness and end as desperation. She thought of the music box and its mournful melody, of the torn glove and the ledger's mysterious initials. pieces of a puzzle whose image was beginning to show its face. Sometimes murder blooms from sorrow.
Not greed, she said quietly, her gaze lingering on the hedge where frost glittered like tiny shards of truth.
Chapter 8. The Holly Street Revelation. The afternoon light slanted through the vicarage windows, softened by lace curtains and the faint wisp of chimney smoke outside. The fire crackled warmly in the grate, and the room held that peculiar hush which always precedes truth being spoken aloud. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair by the hearth, teacup steady in her hand. As the small company gathered, Clara and Edith seated side by side, Inspector Wilkes standing near the window, the vicar's wife perched anxiously on the edge of the sofa, and Constable Wilkes hovering by the door with his notebook ready, though he seemed unlikely to use it. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but unmistakably firm. "I thought it best that we have a little talk before the matter of Mrs. Bartlett's death becomes something more dreadful than it already is." Edith clasped her gloves in her lap. "You speak as though you know what happened, Miss Marple." "I do not presume," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but I observe, and one mustn't underestimate what a few small observations can tell us." She placed a small parcel on the table, the same one that had been found at the scene. Its golden ribbon gleamed dully in the firelight. "This," she said, "is where our story begins and ends."
A gift without a name, delivered with no sender's mark.
Inside, a music box that played Silent Night, and curiously bore a stain of red upon its velvet lining. Clara's breath caught. "Blood?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "or perhaps wax from a candle, though I dare say the former feels more appropriate given the rest of the picture." The inspector folded his arms, listening. He had learned by now that interrupting Miss Marple was both unnecessary and unwise. "The late Mrs. Bartlett," Miss Marple continued, "was not a woman of great means, but she was a woman of conscience. Her ledger showed a curious entry, £50 marked to one R.H. Shortly before her death, she told her niece she intended to make something right, to expose a lie long kept. She turned to the vicar's wife. "And you, my dear, saw a man near the post-box that same night, tall, well-dressed, wearing gloves of particularly fine make." "Yes," the woman said, colour rising to her cheeks.
"I thought he was a stranger at first." Miss Marple smiled faintly.
"Not a stranger. A familiar presence who wished to remain unseen. The same man seen by the stable boy arguing with Mrs. Bartlett near the holly hedge, Mr. Richard Hargreaves, proprietor of the King's Arms." Gasps fluttered around the room like startled birds. Wilkes nodded gravely. "We found his glove behind the counter, black leather, lined with red silk." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, setting her teacup down. "Detail most telling. The mark on Mrs. Bartlett's wrist, the faint red line, matches the hue of that silk." She grasped the glove in her final struggle. "Not in anger, I think, but in fear, and perhaps in recognition." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth.
"And then he killed her?"
Miss Marple's expression was almost sorrowful. "Killed her? Yes, but not out of greed. In every story, the ending begins with the smallest observation. And this one, my dears, began with a promise broken on Christmas Eve." The silence that followed Miss Marple's last words seemed to thicken the air. Even the fire crackled more quietly, as though unwilling to intrude. Clara looked bewildered, trembling slightly. Edith, however, remained perfectly still, her face smooth, composed, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to her, soft but unrelenting. "It was kind of you, my dear, to remain calm through all of this," she said gently. "Most would find such revelations rather trying." Edith's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. Miss Marple rose slowly, moving to the window where the holly hedge could be seen just beyond the vicarage garden.
"It was never about money," she continued.
Mrs. Bartlett was too proud to take bribes and too moral to give them. What she held was not greed, but knowledge.
"And knowledge in the wrong hands can be as deadly as a knife." Inspector Wilkes stepped forward.
"You said it began with a promise broken," he reminded her. "Yes." Miss Marple turned, her hands resting lightly on the chair back. The scarred man, Richard Hargreaves, once courted a young woman in Bath before his ruin. That woman ended the engagement when his debts and deceit came to light. She thought she had escaped disgrace. But Mrs. Bartlett learned the truth when he returned to St. Mary Mead. The young woman was her own niece, Edith. A sharp breath escaped Clara, who turned toward her cousin. Edith, no, surely not. Edith didn't look up. He told you, did he? She said softly. Her voice, though calm, had lost its practiced warmth. I should have known he would. Miss Marple shook her head. He told no one. But Mrs. Bartlett's ledger told me enough. The entry marked R.H. was not hush money, it was repayment. She was helping him begin anew, perhaps even hoping to mend what was broken between you. Edith laughed quietly, bitterly.
To mend? He ruined me. He begged her to forgive him, and she thought she could fix it all.
But she didn't know what she was asking of me. Miss Marple's eyes softened. So when you discovered she meant to return the parcel, the one containing the proof of his past, you went to stop her. Edith looked up at last, her calm slipping into something darker. She was going to post it, to send it all to the constable. Letters, papers, everything that would expose him. She said it was for my sake, to free me from deceit. But she didn't understand.
I didn't want freedom.
I wanted silence. Clara covered her face with shaking hands. Edith continued, voice trembling now despite herself. We argued near the hedge.
I only meant to stop her from leaving.
She pulled away, and I grabbed her arm. The ribbon from my dress must have torn then.
I didn't even realize.
Until I saw it caught there, red against the holly. She fell.
I swear I didn't mean for her to... Her words broke, and she pressed her hands to her eyes. I only wanted her to stop. Miss Marple approached her quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder.
The holly kept its red not from berries, but from guilt, she said softly.
And guilt, my dear, has a way of finding its colour again, no matter how deeply it's buried. Inspector Wilkes exhaled slowly, motioning to the constable.
You'd best come with us, Miss Edith. Edith rose, tears streaking her face, but her posture steady.
It's strange, she murmured. I hated her for trying to save me, and now I wish she had succeeded. As the door closed behind them, Miss Marple turned back to the hearth, where the last of the holly on the mantel had begun to dry and curl.
The red berries glowed faintly in the firelight, tiny witnesses that had kept their secret until the end.